Imagine waking up one day and discovering that your whole life is a huge lie and that your past was actually a great curse. What would you do? I don't know, but this guy here created one of the darkest trilogies in rock.
This is a little story that I like to call The Curse.
I'll share the real story behind Pearl Jam's Alive, Once, and Footsteps. I'm Guilherme, and you're watching DECIFRAHITS. When the only survivor of the grunge era took a story about incest, serial killers, and the death penalty, and turned it into one of the most inspiring trilogies in rock. Few managed to see the true meaning behind this move. Even though these songs have always been sung as an anthem of resistance by young people of an entire generation, this comes from a sad true story that has haunted Eddie Vedder since his teens, when he worked as a gas station attendant and security guard before pursuing music. He received an unexpected visit at his apartment in California, revealing a detail about his life that would be considered a real curse by anyone. There he realized that everything he had lived up to that moment was nothing but a big lie. It was after this devastating news that he composed the songs Alive, Once, and Footsteps as a trilogy. He referred to it as the story of his curse, and its serious consequences have continued to haunt him to this day. With the latest twist of this secret happening recently, still in 2022, and although Eddie Vedder officially named this trilogy Mama's Son, which means Mama's Boy, unfortunately it has nothing to do with motherly love. Actually, this name carries a pretty bizarre symbolism, which starts to be revealed right in the first song.
You tell me these secrets I'm supposedly supposed to forgive, but I have to find a way to live with it. So it was a curse. I'm still alive.
This curse originated during the darkest period of the singer's life, at a time when Eddie Vedder didn't exist. At the time, he was still called Edward Miller, son of Karen Vedder and the lawyer Peter Miller, with whom Eddie never had a good relationship. There were many fights, and he went through tough times at home because of Peter. He believed that his mother only stayed in the marriage because she couldn't support him and his 3 younger siblings on her own, including one of the first disciples. Eddie's public outbursts about the anger he felt toward Peter happened during a Pearl Jam show in Atlanta, when he was introducing the song Better Man.
This song was written long ago and is dedicated to the jerk who married my mother.
As soon as Eddie got a job at a pharmacy at just 15 years old, he decided to live on his own. And since then, Eddie and Peter haven't spoken to each other anymore. But from that point on, Eddie's life turned upside down. His reality became completely different from that of any other boy his age. While the other kids carried notebooks and pencils in their backpacks, he carried bills, electricity bills, and water bills to pay. Unfortunately, it was a time when facing a double shift of studying and working outside the house was the only possible option for those who needed to make some money. Ed Vedder had to keep up this double shift of work and study as long as he could, but he ended up having to drop out of high school in his senior year. A short time later, Ed was alone in his apartment when he got an unexpected visit from his mother, bringing news that would change his life forever. Son, she said, I have a story to tell you. The man you thought was your father was nothing but a... At that moment, he found out that Edward Miller never existed. His real name was Edward Louis Severson III. In other words, his mother and stepfather lied to him his whole life, and he grew up believing that a man he hated was his real father. The reality was that Karen had separated from Ed's biological father when he was only 1 year old. Sometime later, Karen married Peter Miller, had 3 more children, but she had never told Ed that Peter was actually his stepfather.
That was a shock, but even so, I was very grateful. I was like, damn, thank God, because I really didn't want to.
To have come from this guy's sack, I have nothing of this guy's genetics.
It was after this revelation that Ed dropped the last name Miller and decided to take his mother's maiden name. becoming Ed Vedder. Despite that, from that point on, Vedder's relationship with his mother was completely shaken. Because when he found out who his real father was, his entire past changed completely, turning into a real curse. While you were alone at home at 13 years old, your real father was dying. I'm sorry you didn't get to see him, but I'm glad we talked. Vedder had actually met his biological father a few times as a child, but his mother and stepfather made him believe he was just a family friend. Ed remembers that one of the few times he saw his real father, he was in the hospital in very poor health, using crutches and a wheelchair, shortly after his father passed away from multiple sclerosis. And unfortunately, this happened just before Vedder found out the whole truth about him. I had to deal with the fact that he was dead. My biological father was no longer in this world. I had to deal with the anger of not being told sooner, of not being told while he was alive. I was a big secret. Secrets are bad news. Secrets about adoption or anything like that have to be revealed and not kept, because it only grows darker, deeper, uglier, and more confusing. And if that wasn't enough, having to go through all of this, Vedder also discovered another secret about his father's life, which inspired one of the most controversial parts of this trilogy. Ed's biological father was a musician who sang in bars and restaurants, and as soon as the whole truth came out, some relatives started showing up making certain comments that didn't make Ed very happy. They would say, "Oh, now it makes sense. That's where all your talent comes from." Of course, this kind of comment only made Ed more confused and angrier than he already was, because that took away the credit for all the effort he had been making to become who he is. I learned to play the guitar, I saved money to buy equipment, and you're saying my talent came from some gig at an old bankrupt restaurant. Go screw yourselves. Another thing Ed's relatives couldn't help but talk about was the incredible physical resemblance between the two. The family members looked at him as if he were a replacement for his father. And it's exactly that feeling that gave Ed the inspiration to imagine the most abominable verse of Alive. Music? As she slowly walked through a young man's room, she said, "I'm ready for you." These lines symbolize the dark feelings of that mother, who starts to see her son as a replica of her deceased husband. She strangely desires him and sexually abuses her own son. But even though Ed was never a victim of abuse or had any incestuous relationship with his own mother, this verse is one of the pillars for you to understand the first twist of this trilogy, which will happen later on. She asked, "Is something wrong?" "Well, of course there is." "You're still alive," she said. "Ah, and I deserve to be. After all this, is staying alive a good thing or a curse?" That's a question that unfortunately other music icons weren't able to answer in the best way. For the sole grunge era survivor, that question felt different. Instead of taking irreparable actions in his life, he decided to vent all his anguish. In art, Vedder was inspired by a real case of a psychopath and created a new song, letting the character in his story answer that question. In the second part of the trilogy, I admit what I can say, I will relive this without any pain. In Once, the abused young man becomes a killer as he walks down the street with a caliber 16 hidden in his pocket. He sees a prostitute on the road and decides to take it out on her. All the disgust from the trauma he experienced, controlled by a sense of imminent emotional explosion, represented in the lyrics by a bomb in his head that's about to go off at any moment. He faces internal conflict, but on the outside, he pretends to act calmly and with determination. He kidnaps the prostitute, throws her onto the passenger seat of the car, discreetly puts his hand in his pocket, and prays, as if he were asking for courage to finish what he started. There was a time when I could control myself. There was a time when I could lose myself. To write this story, Ed Vedder was inspired by a real case known as the Green River Killer. a serial killer from Washington who was sentenced to life in prison for 48 murders committed between the 80s and 90s, where most of his victims were prostitutes and women in vulnerable circumstances. Somehow, I identified with that. I think this happens much more than we imagine. It's a modern way of dealing with a bad life. I'm glad I became a songwriter. There was a time when I could love myself. There was a time when I could love you. If, in the previous choruses, the character laments his total loss of control and disconnection from reality, here he becomes desperate as he admits that he can no longer feel empathy for himself or for anyone else. It's even because of this final confession that some people believe once is the character's testimony about his crimes to the police, which makes a lot of sense when you understand the fatality in the last piece of this trilogy. Don't even think about looking for me. I won't be home. Footsteps symbolizes the character's mind returning to his cruel reality. Now he suffers the grave consequences of his actions, isolated in a prison cell while he awaits the execution of his death sentence. Haunted by the traumas of his past, hearing voices in his head and collecting scars on his body. I have scratches all over my arm, one for each day since I broke down. And just like in the song that starts the trilogy, the lyrics of Footsteps also tell about a conversation with his mother. But almost at the end of the song, he starts to reinterpret his hatred, giving a hint of the second twist in this trilogy. If there's a reason, no, there was no reason at all. And if there's something you'd like to do, just let me keep blaming you, even though he asked to keep blaming his mother. That's just lip service, because here he finally realizes that there were no reasons to justify his cruel actions. Now, in his final moments of life, the only way he sees to find any kind of comfort is by pretending that someone else, this person, is responsible for his tragic fate. By the way, that's something we've all done at some point. Because blaming someone else is much easier than having to face responsibility for our own choices, due to a lack of maturity. It was exactly this attitude that Eddie Vedder brought into his life when he received the news about his father, and that he, consequently, brought into his music. When he created this trilogy, since he still referred to it as the story of his curse, something that still haunted him every time he sang these songs on stage. But despite what many people think, the meaning of this trilogy didn't end with Footsteps. As time went by, Eddie Vedder's story took two more major turns, which not only changed the original meaning of the trilogy, but also transformed Vedder's life and feelings forever. The first twist happened more than 20 years after the release of Alive, when, during the VH1 Storyteller series in 2006, the singer revealed a detail about the meaning of the song. He said that over the years, Pearl Jam performed for increasingly larger audiences, and because of that, people started singing the chorus, "I'm still alive," in a way he had never imagined. While for him, those words meant a curse, fans were jumping, using their bodies to express themselves and singing, "I'm still alive" en masse, as if it were a great celebration. Watching every night that sea of people interpreting the song in their own way and in such a positive way made the feeling inside Vedder about Alive start to change.
The audience changed the meaning of those words. When they sing "I'm still alive," it's like they're celebrating. And that's the point. When they change the meaning of those words, they break the curse.
To me, the chorus, "I'm still alive," holds new meaning even now. Because when you stop to think that Eddie Vedder is the only one among the great grunge vocalists who's still alive, it gives you chills, man. When a person is humble enough to accept the changes that give new meaning to their own vulnerabilities, this can attract some completely unexpected events, but they're essential to help heal your wounds. And that brings us to the second turning point in Eddie Vedder's life. It happened more than 30 years after that revelation, when he finally found the last missing piece to complete the story of his real father. In 2010, Eddie Vedder went to Arizona to watch a jazz performance at a small local club. When he got there, he found out that the guy playing the keyboard was one of his biological father's best friends. The keyboardist showed Eddie some photos of him and his father together, making music in makeshift studios in the basement at home, and gave them to him as a gift, something he never imagined could exist. A record containing 5 songs recorded by his father. Vedder kept that record at home for about 3 months without having the courage to listen to it. Until after a few bottles of wine on a cold night in Argentina, he finally gathered the courage and played that record. When Vedder heard his father singing for the first time, he was in for a huge surprise.
It sounded good, the production was great, his voice was amazing, but the coolest thing is, he was fucking awesome.
Despite the happiness of hearing his father's voice, Vedder kept these songs, which were so valuable to him, a secret for almost 10 years. Until, in 2022, he released his 3rd solo album, Earthling, which features big names in music like Stevie Wonder, Elton John, and Ringo Starr. To close the album, Eddie Vedder and the producer decided to pay tribute. They made an arrangement to include Eddie's father's vocals on the last track, On My Way. When he heard his father's voice, Vedder not only completed the meaning of the trilogy, but also made peace with the deepest part of himself. And by listening to the audience's interpretation, Vedder began to understand the logic behind his mother keeping that secret for so long, according to what he revealed in a recent interview. Today, Vedder believes that since he and his brothers were very close, his mother probably just wanted her children to feel 100% like siblings, without any kind of differentiation. That would make them feel somewhat separated. The most impressive part of this story isn't just Eddie Vedder's genius in transforming his pain into art, but also his courage to confront his past and find new meaning in his pain. Also his humility in letting music heal what silence destroyed for years. That wasn't the only time Eddie Vedder used his pain to create music. The song Black is one of Pearl Jam's most emotional hits, and hides such deep suffering from Eddie Vedder's life that he even wanted to stop his own fans from singing it. That song,